Let me just introduce the presentation by saying thank you. I think I've chosen the right city, and you might think it would be easy for me to be confused given my nationality, where I reside, but the weather is certainly better here than it is for my home country, and it is in London. So lovely to be here. Even better to be talking about data centers in Belgium, and the reason why. Really, first of all, this presentation will be a study in contrast, or it will be a stark contrast to the one before. A lot more numbers, less words, but the story is quite a basic one when it comes to the Belgium data center market. And if there's anything I want you to take away from the presentation that I'll deliver over the next, say, 13 to 15 minutes, it's that the Belgium data center market is relatively small by European standards, but it is fast growing. The best is yet to come. Really that simple. So let me start by painting that picture. So where does Brussels sit in the European scheme of European data center markets? And as we know, data centers tend to be clustered in metro markets for the most part. Brussels is not on there. And the reason why is because it's not one of the top 7 or 8 markets. What I can tell you, though, is it's gaining ground on those markets. So right now, we have in all of Europe, at the end of last year, we're just about to report our Q1 numbers, by the way, at CBRE, and we track 52 metro markets across EMEA, so we have a good perspective on not just Europe, but Middle East and Africa as well, too. There are 5 gigawatts in operation right now, so what does that mean? It just means that the data center market is growing and growing quickly. It's becoming more power intensive than ever, but that power is largely concentrated. The data center clusters are largely concentrated in 5 metro markets, for those of you who are not as familiar with the industry as others. So that's what we call the FLAP D markets: Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. After that, there's sort of a long tail of markets, and those vary greatly, and they tend to be the faster growing segment. Milan and Madrid are the fastest growing ones. Brussels, though, has grown tremendously as well, too, and we'll talk about that growth. But it is still sort of a relatively small market compared to the largest ones in Europe. And most, again, that footprint, the data center footprint in Europe, where most of the data centers reside, where the power is concentrated, is in the primary markets. But those markets are increasingly saturated. And by saturated, I mean there's a lack of available resource, as those of you in the industry may know all too well. So Brussels is of growing interest, but still a relatively small market any way you cut it. And it's a small market, even by Benelux standards. So we compare Brussels to its metro market peers across Europe. Relatively small. Well, Belgium, and we'll use those terms interchangeably because Brussels is easily the largest data center market in Belgium. But even by Benelux standards, Belgium is relatively small. So Netherlands, not surprisingly, for those of you in the audience who know the industry, it occupies virtually or is responsible for about 90% of the supply in all of Benelux. Now that's changing somewhat. Belgium's growing its share of the pie, but again, Netherlands as a result of the incredible footprint of data centers that are in Amsterdam is the largest country in terms of data center footprint in the Netherlands, and Belgium trails thereafter. And as far as that megawatt figure, I mean, again, a lot of data, but all you need to know about the Benelux figure is that that's roughly 60% of what Frankfurt alone will be at the end of this year. So again, relatively large region when you compile those figures, but the super league of data centers is really in London and Frankfurt, and then there's sort of everyone else. But that's changing. There's nearly a gigawatt of supply, so there's more demand than ever for data center capacity, which is a great story, or a great demand signal, a great problem to have, if you will, if you're data center providers, despite that lack of resource I mentioned earlier. Data center providers are working harder than ever to deliver the supply to meet the demand that their customers, who are primarily hyperscalers, because the industry is largely wholesale oriented. So they're bringing more supply on than ever. This year is emblematic of that trend. We're going to have roughly 950 megawatts, so approaching a gigawatt of supply. What's interesting about that for those in the audience here today that care about Belgium is that more and more of that supply is going to be delivered in the secondary markets of Europe, and that's because hyperscalers and AI providers want to be there. They want capacity in smaller markets, not just in the super league of data center markets that I mentioned just previously. There's more resource here, we'll get to that. But those drivers that you see below you is really what's leading to that growth. And not surprisingly, hyperscaler investments at the very left, the market constraints I mentioned, AI is factoring greatly into it as well too. So, there hasn't been a oh shit moment as the previous speaker said, but there's kind of been an oh no moment or a series thereof over the past several years. In other words, hyperscalers and their provider partners have said, no, it's going to be harder to do that, or no, we can't do that, so therefore we need to invest elsewhere, and that's what we're seeing. So that secondary market segment is, again, is growing faster than the primary market segment, again, the flat D portion of the market, but that in absolute terms, that figure is relatively small. But again, 20% supply that's how much the European market is going to grow this year. So we're getting near to the 6 gigawatt mark, or we will be near that 6 gigawatt mark by the end of the year. And where the Brussels story becomes a lot more interesting is it's not just a small market, but it's a fast-growing market, as I mentioned before. And it's fast-growing compared to really any market, but I think an apples-to-apples comparison, a fair comparison, is to compare Brussels to its secondary market peers. So not to Frankfurt, not to London, Amsterdam, as I mentioned before, but more to markets like Stockholm. And I say I'll point to Stockholm because it is one of the larger secondary markets. And it's not just because it has nothing to do with the fact it's in the Nordics. I was going to say it's the Nordics, but the fact that it is more of a retail-oriented market, much like Helsinki or Copenhagen or a whole slew of smaller secondary markets. And that's what Brussels has looked like for a long time. So what do I mean by retail market? Well, providers here have traditionally appealed to local enterprise or those with non-hyperscaler needs, looking to take capacity, not multiple megawatts, but in smaller chunks, you might say, of capacity. But the market's changing. And the market's changing, and you can see that by virtue of the incredible growth. That green bar, and there's an eye chart here, but that green bar underneath the Brussels header. And that's circa 65-70% growth that we're expecting to see this year, largely from two providers, and we'll get to that a bit later. But it's more of a speculative build, but there are signs that hyperscalers are investing here, or hyperscalers have invested here and are likely to take that capacity. So Brussels, really the fastest growing market in terms of supply this year, faster than Milan, faster than Warsaw, other faster growing, high growth secondary markets. And all told, we expect the vacancy rate to be relatively low by secondary market standards. Now, not as low as Milan. And Milan is sort of the poster child for secondary market success or growth. And so Milan, incredible growth year on year in terms of supply, and very little vacancy. So in other words, whatever's being delivered there is largely taken up by hyperscalers. And that makes Milan sort of a success story in its own right. But Brussels merit to that growth too. Even though some of that supply is going to be delivered speculatively, we expect that to go down, that vacancy to be relatively low here by secondary market standards. So a lot of promise in the market, and we're seeing more supply delivered. The market is becoming more wholesale-orientated, and again, growing faster here than a lot of other secondary markets. So I've stolen some of my own thunder. That market is becoming more wholesale-oriented than ever, as I said, and we expect that to remain the case, or to be the case, for the next 5 years. In other words, more supply will be delivered. It will be more hyperscaler suitable or AI suitable. Workloads are only becoming more compute intensive, and so less floor space needed, but more power needed, and therefore more supply to be delivered. What won't change is the composition of that supply, let's say. So Brussels will very much remain the epicenter of the Belgium data center markets, the way we see it, over the foreseeable future. And there are good reasons for that growth. So I mentioned market constraints in the largest primary markets. Well, Brussels has a unique set of attributes to it. Its geographic location, for starters. So if I go right to left, so it makes for a connectivity throughway, as I put it. So those looking to connect, organizations looking to find throughways to the rest of the continent, can very much do so via Brussels. That makes it so its geographic position helps. But I think perhaps more importantly, or just as importantly at least, is competitive power pricing. So We all know, especially post-war in the Ukraine, power prices have shot up and have remained relatively high, even though they've dipped. So that makes the total cost of ownership for those that buy data center capacity a problem. It's easily the largest line item, if you will, in an infrastructure buyer's budget. So you need competitive power pricing, especially as those workloads grow in terms of compute intensiveness. So, but you also don't have a data center without land. And so available land, appropriate land, again, I reside in London, is increasingly scarce, especially for data center purposes. There's effectively none or limited amounts in Slough, so in West London, where the largest data center submarket, other large data center submarkets in Europe, Offenbach, Hanau, you can name them, have a relative scarcity when it comes to available land and power. So again, that makes Brussels unique. So there's an abundance or enough power here for the industry to have taken note, and their tenants to have taken note, and that's why we're seeing incredible growth here as well. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say availability is driving, again, the industry to deliver more supply and their tenants to locate here in larger numbers. And if you look at any of those metro markets that I've mentioned before, so the 15 that we report on quarterly or semi-annually, or any European metro market, power availability is an issue number one. And so, not just power availability, but availability of data center capacity, and that's what I'm talking about here. And so data center capacity is dropping, it's dropping steadily because of that strong demand that I mentioned before. So what does that mean? It means that by the end of this year, vacancy across Europe will be sub 10% for the first time. And effectively, that the vacancy rate will have been halved over a 4-year period. So that's unheard of. It certainly puts unheard of in data center history, co-location data centers history, and puts data centers more in the category of traditional real estate asset classes as well, too. As, say, office space vacancy rate ascends, in fact, their vacancy rate of data centers is descending. So it's really a trend that's going in reverse that we're seeing in other commercial real estate asset classes. So with that scarcity comes the need to build more data centers and higher pricing as well, too. And so that need for additional data center space, again, is leading to a relative data center construction boom here in Belgium. So that data center construction boom has led to really 2 providers that are driving the growth here, certainly this year. We're expecting a full 40 megawatts from 2 providers in the Northeast, LCL and KevLinks, probably no surprise to many of you in the audience, but that will push Brussels into the 100 megawatt territory. So we expect Brussels to be the 11th market in Europe by the end of this year to be over 100 megawatts. And so that puts Brussels in a relatively unique category. And again, solidifies its status as a proper secondary market. It's been a diverse market for some time, so retail capacity is a stalwart of this data center market, and so we're seeing additional capacity added, or we expect additional capacity this year as well too, but more on the retail side. So all told, the entire market's growing, but largely a function of delivery of wholesale supply. And those data centers are going to be increasingly larger because of that wholesale orientation, or the shift to that wholesale orientation. So data centers here are going to look a lot more like they do in the top 5 markets. So we see massive data centers that have been delivered over the last few years in the form of Iron Mountain, or from Iron Mountain rather, and Cloud HQ in Paris and London. And there are others that I could cite as well too. These are 2 random examples, but the average wholesale facility in the primary markets is now, by the end of next year, is going to be about 35 megawatts, and data centers here are going to look a lot more like that. So with that, I'd like to say thanks for your time. Hopefully you have some perspective on the market now, and happy to take any questions either now or, well, I think Zoe's going to move me on, but certainly talk to you after or by email, if not now. Thank you for your time.